Well, hello everyone at Holy Cross. If hopefully you have seen the announcement that I made on our Facebook and on our YouTube that this year's Lenten series is going to be based on the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And if you've been listening to sermons, and I hope that you have, for the past couple of years, you will have heard a lot of quotes from Bonhoeffer. I read him a lot. I respect him a lot. And so when I decided to do this 40 days with Dietrich, I thought it would be really good to talk to someone who knows more about Dietrich Bonhoeffer than I do. And so with me is Corey Tuttle. Corey has just finished his master's degree in Bonhoeffer's theology. And his thesis is called Surrendering Autonomy in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Theology. He is also the curator, the host, the interviewer of the BONHOEFFER podcast, which is the best Bonhoeffer podcast out there. And he is talking to high-level scholars. Like, these are the names that you go to when you want to know more about Bonhoeffer. And Corey is reading their stuff and interviewing with these people. And I've learned a lot from listening to this podcast. Corey, thank you very much for agreeing to chat with me today.
Yeah, my pleasure. I really appreciate you reaching out. I'm excited to do this.
Oh, wonderful. So why don't you first describe a little bit, like, how did you get into Bonhoeffer and why did you decide this is the guy I want to study?
It's a bit silly when I think back of how I got into this. I think there's a lot of I guess interest in World War II things, like movies and books and
Sure.
things like that. I just grew up kind of consuming those sorts of things. And the silly part is also really interested in like spies, that sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah.
Spy movies, James Bond, all that stuff. And I became a Christian at the end of my senior year of high school. So shortly after, I went straight from there to Bible college.
Okay.
And while I was in Bible college, came across, the Cost of Discipleship. And it was at that time, Eric Metaxas's biography.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was like a newly Christian and loved these genres of entertainment. And his book was called Pastor, Prophet, Martyr, Spy. So it was just like checking all the boxes.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah.
So I started reading his book and I just devoured it. I mean, I read it 3 times in my undergrad, like almost.
Oh, wow.
I was just like obsessed with it. That's kind of my personality. I don't just read Bonhoeffer. I create a Bonhoeffer podcast.
Sure. Yeah.
I get into stuff, you know? So yeah, I just really, everything resonated with me. I think obviously, I mean, you probably know this. I'm not sure if a bunch of your congregants would know this, that it's not necessarily the best historical biography available.
Sure. Yeah.
But he
has a lens that he's really always trying to push through.
Yeah, and me 10 years ago, that was definitely my lens. I was like reading someone like, oh, this guy's exactly like me. Turns out he's not. But it was, that's kind of what hooked me. And then I Googled classes on Bonhoeffer at the master's level in the city that I was in, Spokane, Washington. And I found I sat in on a professor like 2008, so a long time ago. I went to Whitworth. One of my friends was going there, Whitworth University in Spokane. And I was like, it was just a basic Christian theology lecture and I really enjoyed it. And then, I graduated undergrad 2015 and took a couple years off, had kids, all that jazz. And then I just Googled classes in Spokane on Bonhoeffer and saw that guy, Dr. Adam Nieder, taught a class on Bonhoeffer. I'm like, oh, I sat in a class with that guy. I really loved him. So I applied and did that for the past couple of years, and now I'm here.
Wonderful. One of the things that you say in one of your podcasts or a couple of your podcasts is that as you started reading more about Bonhoeffer, that he changed for you. So, so what was that change? And ultimately, was that a good change? That he started one way through kind of Metaxas's book. This guy believes everything that I think. But then as you went along, you found that wasn't the case.
I think it was such a good exercise for me, being so young and trying to just follow Jesus and knowing that I come to these things with an ideological lens as well. And then I see, like, I actually wrote a paper about this in graduate school, that if people are so willing to take Bonhoeffer and kind of make him the person that they want him to be, they leave out all the stuff that that doesn't fit their worldview. How much more willing are they to do it with Christ? And kind of, so it's been a huge exercise for me to kind of like pull back and like try to examine the person as a whole and kind of interact with him in the areas that I agree with him, that I wouldn't agree with him. And so it's been great. Like, normally I've had people ask me that before, that like, oh, now that he doesn't, like, he thinks differently than you, do you feel like you don't want to study him more? I'm like, no, it makes me want to study him more. Like, I think a lot of people are doing this. And I think there's been a lot of research and scholarship showing that this is the case, that people have done this with Bonhoeffer's thought since Bonhoeffer's thought has been available in print.
Sure, absolutely.
So it's just like been a really great growing experience to kind of try to keep some sort of objective view of the person. You know what I mean? Absolutely.
He does really rest in this kind of this messiness. And in some sense, like, that's the life that he's living, right? In 1940s Germany, right? Like, it's really hard to be systematic kind of when the world is crumbling around you. And I always appreciate that. Do you see Bonhoeffer's words as relevant, like, today? And how is he relevant for Christians today?
Yeah, totally. I guess, well, I think that Bonhoeffer has this intrigue because of his biography. I mean, that more than anything, if he just had the words in Discipleship or Life Together, that would be, they are profound in themselves. But the fact that it's coupled with this life, there's a certain kind of like coherence between his life and his thought that I think that we all want as followers of Christ. That I would say that these things are true about me and true about you and true about reality and what God has done in Christ. But I also think, like, if you looked at my life, I think there would be a bunch of blind spots, a bunch of spots where you like, this doesn't line up. And I know that Bonhoeffer is a sinner, and sure, there are plenty of those, there are spots where it doesn't line up. But I think that what you see in him is so much faithfulness, so much courage. And I think we all really deep down want to live courageous lives. And it also has the backdrop of, like, a time that we can't really comprehend now, like a time where Hitler exists. There is a bad guy. We don't really like, in our society now, there are kind of bad guys that still have a lot of support, but it's very clear when we look back in history that this was wrong. And there's this one guy, there's a bunch of people standing up, but one person is saying things like, when Christ calls a man to, he bids him come and die. Right. And then he goes on and become and is executed. And in all of that, you sort of see this sort of devotion, this courage, this faithfulness that I think that deep down we're all really longing for. And I think that I think when I read the Bible and I see Jesus do things, I'm like, yeah, but that's Jesus, But when I read like Bonhoeffer's just a normal guy, and he does all these things, and it's like, oh, this is possible to live. I don't have to throw out the Jesus card, like, oh, well, he's God, so of course he can do that. But seeing just a normal person try to be faithful and end up living a life like this is just remarkable and really inspiring. And I think that, like, regardless of living, like, we don't live in a World War II, torn world, but I think that in everyday life, there's a certain amount of courage and faithfulness that we would all want. And I think he exemplifies it in a really special way.
One of the things that I appreciate, and one of the things that I hope that Holy Cross, like through our Lenten studies, one of the things that I hope that Holy Cross receives, or anybody who is kind of journeying through this 40 days with Dietrich, is I love how Bonhoeffer is so unyieldingly Jesus focused.
For
Like
sure.
everything from his writing on ethics and kind of moral theology, and or to the writing on what constitutes the Christian community, to writing on the Christian life and discipleship, it is all just pointing to the reality of Jesus in our lives.
Yeah.
And I know that for me, that, who kind of exists in the church, and who, like, I have the churchy work, sometimes it's easy to give lip service to that, but then still kind of live based on our own management in our own life.
Totally.
And so I'm always kind of challenged. And where he gets uncomfortable is where he pushes that to the limit, right? Where, well, if you're really following Jesus, this is what it means.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and so we see that all the way through his life in terms of not just advocating for the suffering of the Jews in Nazi Germany, but I just love this, this tall white German teaching Sunday school in Abyssinian Baptist Church in the middle of Harlem, because that's where Jesus calls you, right? And to embrace the other, the person who is distinctly not like you. And that can be challenging.
Yeah. And it's in there. I mean, like, if you look at his biography, it's in those moments, and he really does encounter Jesus in a new way. I mean, he writes over and over again about his time in New York at Abyssinian Baptist teaching Sunday school. Was that's where I really met Jesus. It's kind of what he says.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and then bringing back gospel records to play in the seminary and all this kind of stuff. And so it's the other thing that I love, it's, as you said, he's not a perfect person. I love that he has the opportunity, and he takes the opportunity to flee at one point. So his friends kind of say, hey, you need to get out of there, come back to America, and line up this really prestigious life for him, which he takes. And then kind of on the way there says, no, I can't do that, and goes back. And so there's this deep reflectedness within him to think about, where is Jesus calling me, and then possibly course correct if he needs to.
Yeah, totally. I love it.
I do think, and I don't know if you see this, I find, the way he talks about faith in the world he lives, we don't live in Nazi Germany, and there's not that big bad guy, and our times, there's never going to be like the Second World War. However, I find some of the stuff that he says eerily prophetic for our times.
Totally.
I don't know if you saw that, if you find that as well.
Yeah, especially in Letters and Papers from Prison. I actually wrote quite a bit about that, about how his stuff about the world coming of age. That we've grown out of our religious parents' basement and now are out on our own, and we can, like, the world has kind of embraced this attitude. It seemed like as he was writing that, it was like starting to be true, and now it is just on a whole
Absolutely.
Nother.
Well, and even as that begins with his letter after 10 years, is that what it's called? After 10, where he starts talking about, kind of the mass leveling events that call us, and he says, away from the cult of the star. And I remember reading that at the start of the pandemic, and kind of hearing echoes of this, what has become really a mass leveling event. Like, it stopped the world.
Yeah, for sure.
And then this call to kind of, return to the book and return away or to go away from the cult of the star. And I thought, well, this is really prophetic. This is really profound for the world in which we are living today. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's great. That's another part about Bonhoeffer, is that it's very timeless. I mean, obviously, there are other theologians that have been around a lot longer whose writing we still kind of pick up, but I mean, it's been 80 years, and we're still like there's more research on Bonhoeffer now than ever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and there's very much a renewed emphasis.
Yeah.
One of the things that I didn't know, what I learned through listening to your podcast, and I can't remember who said it or whatever, but I think there was the point that like Bonhoeffer he wasn't the most popular guy in his day. Like, it's, and his execution goes kind of unnoticed until it's talked about on the radio. So he wasn't the bright and shining star as, people kind of see him today. Like in some sense, he was kind of put off to the side, I guess, a little bit. And partly probably because he was so fearless in saying what he felt Jesus was calling him to do and the church to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I totally agree. Like he's just one small part of the bigger story, but just still, it kind of humbles you and makes you realize that you're a part of that too. You're like one small part of the big story, but you also see kind of like the willingness to be faithful even in the small things.
Absolutely. So the Bonhoeffer podcast, how has it been talking to all these? Because truthfully, you're talking to the who's who of Bonhoeffer scholarship.
Yeah.
So how did that start? How has it been talking to all these people?
Well, truth be told, I did a podcast a long time ago with my brother, a soccer podcast, and in the process, I read a book about a soccer team, and I was like, reached out to that guy and asked him, hey, could I interview you and talk to you about your book? And then I realized authors will talk to you for free if you have a podcast. So, and I'm just a student, I don't, especially at the very beginning of all this, nothing about Bonhoeffer. I think I had just read Discipleship and Life Together, and that was it. There's a lot of volumes that I had not read. So I was very new to this and was just like, it'd be way easier if I was just talking to all of these people who knew a lot, who have done PhDs and that sort of thing. So I just figured, okay, well, one author said yes about a soccer book, maybe a Bonhoeffer scholar will say yes, and I can just do this. And it was crazy because it worked. I started the podcast and I just reached out to someone on Twitter that I came across that was a Bonhoeffer PhD from Baylor. And we had like kind of tweeted back and forth a little bit and was just like, hey, I'm thinking about starting this Bonhoeffer podcast. Would you be my first guest? And he was like, absolutely. And so Steve Besner is my first episode, and we still keep in touch. He's great. And then from there, it was just like, once you kind of get one under your belt, especially I think episode 3, I had Barry Harvey and I had Stephen Haynes. So both of those people are people that are part of the Bonhoeffer Society.
Okay.
So as I send more emails, I'm able to be like, hey, here's the list of people I have on. And more people are more comfortable with it. They're like, oh, I know that person. And then obviously you can just send them a recording. Like, here's kind of the feel for it. I'm not trying to I'm sending like, plenty of people have asked, like, can I get the questions beforehand? Glad to do that. So I'm trying to keep it like really simple, really friendly. Like I really am just looking to learn. And I think most of the people that I'm interviewing are teachers of some kind. They're professors, or so they have sort of a teacher's heart that want to kind of like, oh, you want to learn the thing I'm an expert in? And I'm like, yes, I do.
Right on.
So everyone's been really gracious, and it's great. I mean, I don't see stopping anytime soon because they're so willing to teach me, and I'm really willing to learn. So we'll see.
Absolutely. No, that's fabulous. Yeah. Wonderful. And I've enjoyed, I didn't know that when you started, you had only read those 2 books. One of the things that I enjoyed was listening to how you interacted with all these people. And you're like, oh yeah, this would be great for my thesis. Or, oh, I'm just reading this right now. And so you kind of had your own journey with these people.
Yeah. And that was the coolest part, was just as I was reading, even like off air, I would ask people like, hey, what do you think about this? Because especially for people who have new books coming out, I want to really kind of just get on their books and not really like stay away from me quite a bit. But there would be times where off air, I'd be like, hey, I have some things I want to ask you about my work. what do you think about this and this and this? And everyone's so helpful. Like, yeah, I can think of almost every single person I've interviewed have like threw me a bone that I had not seen before, that I was able to be like, oh great, I will throw that into my thesis. And like, then I feel more, you know, at the end of it, you're like, I have had input from all of these scholars that that I wouldn't have met otherwise. So it's
Sure.
just
Cool. Absolutely. So, okay. So speaking about your work, so you've submitted all your past, you're a master in theology.
Yes.
So what, what does it mean for Bonhoeffer to surrender autonomy?
So my work, so what I wanted to do with the project was to basically that coherence that I was talking about, that between his life and his thought. I wanted to try to find out. I'm a firm believer that like what you really believe will determine how you live. So I wanted to figure out what was Bonhoeffer thinking that made him live that way, so that I can think those things, so that I can live kind of a courageous, faithful life. And so I started out just like searching his anthropology, like what he thought it meant to be a human. And in that, I sort of saw this Christology, like this relationship between Christ and believers. And from there, I just kind of followed this theme. And so I defined autonomy in my paper as being self-directed. So there's this bit in, it's in Creation and Fall and in Ethics. It's really clear in Ethics where Bonhoeffer says something that's so profound it's profound, but it's really weird because it's like, this has never crossed my mind. Where he says, he asks the question, what does it mean to do Christian ethics? And then he says, well, we can't really do Christian ethics, because to do an ethic is to ask the question, what is the good?
Yeah.
And then he says, but if you look back in Genesis 1-3, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we weren't supposed to know good. That was an off-limit tree. Yeah. What was supposed to happen and what happened before that was, he calls it unbroken obedience. That was just hearing and doing the will of God. So to do Christian ethics is not to ask the question, the typical, ethical question, what is the good, but to ask the question, what is the will of God? The will of God, yeah. And so I kind of took both of those, both that section, his description of in Creation and Fall as God, human beings never looking at themselves, only looking to God, never disobeying. They would just hear commands and do them. They would never question them. And he even says that like what happens after the fall is that God says, like, go do this. And what human beings do is they use their knowledge of good and evil to judge the command of God. Did God really say this? That's what, or is this a good idea? And they kind of assert value in judgments, and they do that to themselves. They like judge whether or not they're super sinful or not. And they don't allow God to be their judge. And so I saw that all of that was coming out of being self-directed, that the self is the guide to life. And the master of your fate, captain of your soul kind of thing. Bonhoeffer is very, very against that idea. You see it all the time, discipleship, where he says, never look at yourself, only look out to Christ. And then in ethics, over and over again, he says, I'm trying to think of the quote. It's actually where it says surrendering autonomy. And that's kind of where I got the term. But I kind of separate the thesis in between practical autonomy, which is what you do in your day-to-day life, like how you act out your life, and cognitive autonomy, sort of viewing the self, using that self, that knowledge of good and evil to judge yourself as a sinner or a savior. And Bonhoeffer's all about just giving all of that up and only looking to Christ, and sort of a return to before the fall. So I kind of trace that throughout the whole Bonhoeffer works. I kind of show, I mentioned in Letters and Papers, the world coming of age is really a world that has embraced autonomy. So really from start to finish, I see, like you see that, and I kind of cite every single work along the way, that he is constantly trying to get back to that. And you see that with even his return to when he goes to America the second time, and he realizes he does something wrong. He writes, like, reflecting on his decision to go back, that he was sitting out in the garden praying, and then he was just asking, what is the will of God? And he's just trying to surrender his autonomy, and he feels that God has called him to go back. And then what do we see? His obedience to God. So that's kind of like the thesis of my thesis, is that the central theme is human beings surrendering autonomy and obedience to the will of God. And then that's how we can kind of learn to live faithful lives like Bonhoeffer is, again and again. Bonhoeffer has this view of a Christian life that is moment by moment dependence. I write my thesis. I was able to get one matrix illustration that they allowed me to have, that Bonhoeffer has this thing where, when it comes to ethics, especially in his book Ethics, he talks about how he's not doesn't live by principled ethics. In a sense, it's like, here are the things to do in your life and you're good. But instead, because what principled ethics is a breaking away from God. It's like me saying, hey, God, what do you want me to do? Okay, great. I'll just go do it. And I'll never depend on God. And I'll just live off my knowledge of good and evil and do things accordingly. So I have this illustration of the Matrix, where Neo answers the phone, and it's Morpheus, and he's getting out of the office. I'm not sure if you've seen it. And Morpheus says, the bad guys, the antagonists, the agents are coming. You need to turn left, go right, go straight, duck down, and like gives them all these instructions to get him out of the office. And that is the view that Bonhoeffer has for life, like a constant connection to Jesus as a present living God who guides you in life. And whereas principled ethics would be like, can you just like tell me how to get out of this office and get away from these guys, and I'll talk to you later. But all of that is, to be able to do that is to be able to surrender your autonomy and not live from the self anymore, but live according to Christ.
Absolutely. Well, that's fabulous. I really appreciated just having to read Ethics now. And it's really quite a profound thought that I've never really thought about, when he starts talking about the two spheres, Luther's kind of two kingdoms, and he wants to kind of change it a little bit. We might call it the secular sacred divide today. And he wants us to say, well, no, Jesus determines the reality. And it doesn't matter if you're in the church or if you're in the secular world. Even if you're there, it is Jesus that determines the reality of that place. And so that moment by moment obedience and discipleship and relationship with Jesus is so foundational, I think, and challenging and inspiring to how we go about those moment by moments in our day.
Yeah, totally. And I think as I've finished it, the thesis, and really thinking about how I apply it to my life, I am more and more convinced about how much attention plays in that role. And so I'm constantly trying to adjust here, because we live in a social media smartphone world that we get notifications every 30 seconds and we can't hold our attention span at all. And it seems like Bonhoeffer's view of the Christian life is one where he is dead focused on Jesus a lot, and I'm constantly kind of training himself in that. So that's just something I'm kind of working on personally since kind of reading through all that.
Yeah, he comes across as a very intense person, but when you read the biographies and stuff, one of the things that you constantly hear is that he loved games. Yeah, exactly. So for the Bonhoeffer podcast, you're wanting to establish a reading group. Can you talk a little bit about what that might be or look like?
Yeah. So basically, the idea is, so I have this thing. It's called a Patreon. I'm not sure if your listeners have heard of it, but it's sort of a way to kind of support the podcast. The podcast costs about $20 a month, so I'm trying to get a little bit of support
over time. That adds up.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And luckily, I have plenty of people so far that have been willing to kind of help me along the journey. That's great. But something I want to do is to create a reading group to kind of walk through the Bonhoeffer works together, sort of a small group, 5-6 people,
Sure.
that sort of thing, and sort of record it like this, and then kind of put it out as kind of extra episodes so that people who are just sort of have something to read along with. The reason why I started this was because nothing like it exists. And I really wanted something like that to exist. So I like, you look on YouTube, okay, Bonhoeffer, I want to learn, are there any lectures? Is there anything that I can learn on my own and learn about Bonhoeffer? And there wasn't at the time. And still to this day, like if you really want to learn Bonhoeffer, you kind of have to go to a college or find someone who has been to some sort of intense college that has like yourself. Like I'm sure you could lead a Bonhoeffer study for people in your church, but there aren't a lot of people who have those options, you know?
Sure.
So what I want to do is kind of create an online option there for people to read along. And even if they can't join the reading group, they can sort of read along at their own pace and sort of listen to the discussion and kind of be, like not have to pay a bunch of money to go to a school.
Absolutely.
To get something, just as a layperson that just wants to, is really interested in these things, like I am. I'm just a layperson that's really interested in.
And it really is, the more that you read his stuff, the more that you start seeing the grand themes kind of weave through everything. And I've only scratched the surface, right? So I've read Letters and Papers from Prison and Ethics and Discipleship and Life Together and Creation and Fall.
That's quite a lot. That's good.
I have Act and Being. I haven't.
Best of luck.
Yeah. And Sanctorum Communia, I read that one. So yeah, like it's but you start seeing how things start working together in some sense, which I think that would be fabulous. So so if people want to support the podcast, they would just go to
Patreon. Yeah, patreon.com. So patreon.com/Bonhoeffer Pod. So just like his last name, Bonhoeffer POD.
Yep.
And then there's options to sign up for support and for kind of the reading group and all that jazz.
Well, that'd be lovely. Well, I'm gonna go do that because I'd love to be a part of that reading group. Or it's it'd be fabulous.
Well, we'd love to have you. Yeah. And again, I mean, I think you kind of picked this up. Just I'm really laid back about all of this. So if there's anyone even in your, like, you don't have to support my Patreon, whatever. If you are listening to this and someone in this congregation and you just have questions, you just want to chat about Bonhoeffer, I would love to do that. My time is your time. I love it. I want to teach. One day. That's kind of the end goal. So I have the heart to do that. I'd love to just and to hear your thoughts as well. So
fabulous.
My door/email and Twitter are always open.
Well, I can think of a couple people who may actually take you up on that. So that'd be great. That'd be fabulous. So at the end of your podcast, I already told you I'm going to steal your ending because I love the way that you end. And so on the Bonhoeffer podcast, Corey always ends with a game of Desert Island. And I just think that it's just fabulous having all of these top scholars having to play this game. If you are stranded on a desert island, what two books would you take with you? One book written by Bonhoeffer and one book about Bonhoeffer. Now, you never say your choices because you're the host. And so now at this point of your journey in the Bonhoeffer podcast, you've read a whole lot and through your master, so have you made your way through the entire Bonhoeffer works? Yeah. So you've read it all. So what would, let's play Desert Island. What would be your picks?
I have such a lame answer because my Bonhoeffer pick, I mean, you would expect, I read all of the volumes. So you would expect like this big, obscure volume that I would love to get into. The smallest book is the best one for me. I don't know if there is a better book for Christians to read outside the Bible than Life Together. Every line of it. I think we've all heard those people who say like, oh, this book is so quotable. It's like every time I read it, there's so many underlines. every book, every sentence is underlined. It is almost that,
Sure.
but seriously that. I mean, every single page is just filled with so much wisdom about Christian community, and what it means to be the body of Christ. And
do you think we do it this, like, so one of the things we often talk about Life Together as kind of like this is like small B Bonhoeffer, like this is the primer. And so I wonder if we don't realize, do you think we forget the depth that's there, or not realize that? Because I'm with you. I find it just a profound.
Here's kind of my inkling to this, because I definitely interview people who are sort of academic theologians, and I interview people who are pastors. And I think people who are pastors who are trying to sort of lead the body of Christ to be the body of Christ, they see Life Together for all its glory. Whereas I get some people who are just like, ethics is great. And I'm like, it is, but also like the practical thing, like the day-to-day stuff that I am trying to figure out in my own life, that I'm sure all of the people at your church are trying to figure out how to be faithful. Yeah. He has a section there of a day alone. What does it mean for faithful by myself? What does it mean to be faithful with the body of Christ? And just his concept of the wish dream community, where he talks about, that we all have this idea of how we think community should be, and that's actually like an idol that doesn't exist, and that that's getting in the way of the real community that Christ has for us. I think I just need to apply that to my forehead every morning,
exactly,
kind of thing. Just remind myself over and over. So and it's weird. It's like 100 pages, so it's not very long at all. So if people want to get into Bonhoeffer, reading Bonhoeffer, that's where I always suggest to start. That, or discipleship kind of like dips for me. Like there's like, oh, this is amazing, and then there's like, oh, there's like 50 pages of like, oh, this is pretty good. But Life Together is like base melting for 100 pages. I usually tell people to start there, and it's my go-to. I don't think it'll ever not be my Desert Island Bonhoeffer book.
Sure. So what about your Desert Island, a book about Bonhoeffer?
This is another, well, it's not a lame answer, because I think it's a really good book and I think everyone should read it. I really love things when they're put simply. And so I've had a bunch of academic theologians who write on act and being on, and so there's like really, really lofty thoughts. They're great books. They're really great at understanding what he's trying to communicate, that sort of thing. But my favorite is a little book called Bonhoeffer for Armchair Theologians.
Sure.
It is, I think the non-Bonhoeffer, non-theology books, I think the best bit of Bonhoeffer is the biography, right? But almost all the Bonhoeffer biographies are really long. The best biography. Hey, have you read the Betke biography?
No, I have not.
I'm going to hold it up for you. I have it right here. It is 1,048 pages. They are humongous. And the Betke biography is amazing. It's like the one that everyone uses, even all the biographies use, There's quite a few. They're usually 300-400 pages long, which is no problem. I mean, if you're really into it, you can do that. But something I love about Bonhoeffer for Armchair Theologians, it's written by Lori Brant Hale and Stephen Haynes. They're both PhDs. They're both part of the Bonhoeffer Society.
Both have been on your podcast.
Well, yes. And Stephen Haynes writes this section. The first 70 or 80 pages is a Bonhoeffer biography. So it's like an 80-page version of that big old book. So I love that, because it's just like all the high notes.
The highlights,
Yeah, and then the second half of it is like 5 short chapters on the main things that Bonhoeffer says in his theology. So it's like Christ existing as community, sort of the early stuff, the costly grace, so from discipleship, ethics of formation from the book Ethics. There's religionless Christianity in a world come of age, and there's one more. I can't think of it off the top of my head. Vicarious representative action. Bonhoeffer uses that phrase, which I think is one of the coolest phrases I've ever heard.
Mhm.
The vicarious representative
Exactly.
action. That's how Jesus lived for us, and that's how we should live for others. That's kind of the point there. But so it has like a distillation of here are 5 major things that Bonhoeffer communicated, and kind of goes through the sections where it talks about that. The whole book is like 150 pages. So to have all the biography and all like the main points, I don't think
There you go. Yeah.
better. And especially if everyone that asks me like, where should I start with Bonhoeffer? If I say, if you're not starting like with Bonhoeffer text, Bonhoeffer for Armchair Theologians is like perfect.
And listen to the Bonhoeffer podcast.
Sure. Yeah. You can do that. Shoot me an email. I'll be glad to help with any questions.
Absolutely. So one more time, how can people contact you? Through Patreon or email or Twitter? And
yeah, so I'm mainly on as far as social media. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. Both of those. I think Twitter is at Bonhoeffer Pod. If you just look up the Bonhoeffer Podcast on Facebook, that's there. You can find the Patreon at patreon.com/Bonhoeffer Pod. And the podcast is available on SoundCloud and anywhere else that you would get a podcast. So Apple Podcasts, that sort of thing. You just type in the Bonhoeffer Podcast, and it's about 25, 26 episodes. They usually run about 30 to 40 minutes. I actually just like 5 seconds ago, right before I joined this, published a new one on ethics.
okay.
So I'm excited about that, to hear what people think about that. But that one's about an hour long, but you usually run between 30 and 45 minutes, depending on people's availability. So again, and then if you want to email me, even bonhoefferpod@gmail.com. If you have questions, I'd be glad to answer, or if you just want to follow up and kind of chat, I'm glad to do that.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, Corey, again, thank you so much for kind of hanging out. I know we're in the same time zone, and I think we both have kids who will probably need dinner soon. So, but thank you so much. And like I said, and I'll reach out again sometime soon. And I've really enjoyed our chat. So thank you incredibly.
Yeah, please stay in touch. This has been great, and I really appreciate you reaching out. So
absolutely,
that's serious. Like, stay in touch. I'd love to hear from you.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks a lot.